Spirituality Network podcast. In case you're not familiar with the network, this is a group of people, we call ourselves an emerging community, that are actively exploring the integration of diversity and spirituality. If you want to know more about us, please go to our website, diversityandspirituality.com. And if you like the podcast, I invite you to rate us, especially if you like us, on iTunes or wherever you get podcasts, which helps us spread the word. Today, I'm very privileged to be interviewing Casper Kuile, who is the executive director of the OnBeing project. He's got a great title. He's a director of possibility for the Impact Lab, and his work supports 20th century formation. Prior to that, and I guess in the collaboration with the OnBeing project, he was, I guess, one of the collaborators in something called How We Gather, which is a millennial-led spiritual group startup collaboration between the Harvard Divinity School, the Xers Institute, and OnBeing. And what began in 2015 as a student-led exploration of how millennials are finding and building communities of meaning and belonging has morphed into what they call a groundbreaking study of organizations that are effectively unbundling and remixing the functions historically performed by traditional religious institutions. I'll say that he also holds a Master's of Divinity and Public Policy degrees from Harvard University, and who remains a Ministry Innovation Fellow at the Harvard Divinity School. Casper, that's a big mouthful.
I'm sorry.
I didn't even put the Harry Potter thing in there, which is of interest to some people. I don't understand Harry Potter. That's probably why I skipped over it. But in any event, Casper, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, I'm very glad to be here and to join such illustrious company. Thank you.
You know, Casper, I've read most of your reports, and I know a lot of your work has to do with the spirituality of the millennial generation. So it seems appropriate to start this conversation by having you tell me how you situate yourself within this generation. Just tell me about yourself.
Yeah. Well, I grew up in England, but with both parents are Dutch. So I grew up in, I think, both Holland and England are the joint second most secular countries in the world, according to some studies. And that was definitely true in my family. I didn't know anyone who went to church. I couldn't have told you much about the Bible or religion. It wasn't that my family was kind of against religion in any way. It was just absent. You know, my grandparents didn't go to church. It was just a very, it was a sort of an empty space, shall we say, at a formal level in terms of, you know, how I identified. I wouldn't have been able to tell you anything. Growing up in England, you can't avoid the Anglican Church. Of course, the head of state is also the head of the Anglican Church. So there's some bits of culture that just seep into your bones. But I went to a Waldorf school. I don't know if you're familiar with Steiner education.
I am. I'm sorry. I'm going to
no worries.
Stop this. It's hard to stop these things.
I could repeat that bit.
Please do.
We're professionals.
Waldorf schools.
Yeah. So I grew up going to a Waldorf school and a Steiner school, which you may be familiar with. And if you know anything about Waldorf, it's a very holistic development of the child. The focus is on your creativity and on being connected to nature. And this, you know, you start every day with the by standing up and kind of crossing your arms across your chest and saying the morning poem, and you there's all these festivals. You know, we danced around the maypole and we sang to the cattle at Christmas, and you know, I felt very much at home within a kind of pagan-y Christian calendar without ever knowing that that's what it was or what it was called. It was just what we did. And so coming, you know, now moving to America and going to divinity school and having this whole journey, I look back at that time and I think, well, it wasn't overtly religious, but it was certainly spiritual. You know, my family would go to the same summer camps in Holland, and we knew all the songs, and so we would sing together a lot as a family. And you know, stories were read. We lived in this very unusual village with lots of. There was an international school of storytelling, for example. So on the 23rd of December every year, one of the local storytellers would come and tell Dickens's Christmas Carol off by heart in front of a packed living room of kind of 45 people squished onto the floor. And that was the rhythm of my life, a very strong community, a very kind of articulated calendar in which there were these ritual moments in which people came together. But I chose to leave when I was 10 because I wanted to do geography and science. In the Steiner education system, you really only learn to spell properly when you're about 9. So I was in my local Boy Scouts club, and I felt very stupid not knowing how to read and write properly. So I was insistent that I had to leave, and my parents generously let me go. And so I ended up in a very posh English boarding school, which had morning chapel and a much more strong kind of Anglican presence. And as a gay teenager, I came out when I was 16, 17. Very quickly, I realized that as a gay boy, I was not welcome in this religious framework. And so if religion said, screw you, to me, I just said, screw you right back. And religion was, at best irrelevant and at worst cruel. And so I didn't even engage with it. And I took all my kind of teenage, anger and anxiety into becoming, when I got to college, I became a climate activist. So I got very involved with organizing young people around climate change and worked for 3-4 years in the kind of nonprofit sector in London. But had a real turning point when we've been working towards these big United Nations climate negotiations, where the hope was that there'd be some sort of global deal to cut carbon emissions. And we had been protesting and petitioning and doing, direct action kind of protests. And I had 2 friends who went on hunger strike for over a month. So we were really in it, I stopped flying, I became a vegetarian, like all these big behavior changes. And the talks failed. The talks did not work out as we wanted them to. And in my kind of 23, 24-year-old self, I was completely at a loss because the problem that I was trying to solve was so far outmatched to the tools that I felt I had available to me. And in all of the history books that I was reading about, social movements, whether it was Thomas Clarkson and the abolitionist movement or the civil rights movement and Ella Baker and Bayard Rustin and just seeing how they would sing together, or they felt part of a bigger story, or there were these ritual moments where people came together. Like there was more than just petitions and protests. Mm-hmm. And so I was getting more and more curious about religion as a strategy.
Religion as a strategy.
Really, because for social change, I was like, here is the best, the longest lasting institution that I know of, the church, and how has it mobilized people? So I came to America to do a public policy degree, but very quickly heard about the divinity school and thought, oh, this is for me. And so when I came to the div school, I would have described myself as an atheist. I didn't have any more language to say, the God that I was told about is not what I believe in. Like, that's crazy. Now, of course, things are much more complicated. But I still find myself, I've kind of bricolaged together a spiritual life where I keep a tech Sabbath and I say the Lord's Prayer in the morning, but I turn a tarot card every morning. So instead of saying Our Father, I'll say Our Links or Our Patience, whatever the card is. That's how I try. It's kind of like St. Francis trying to find the face of God in every animal that you find or whatever. But so I find myself steeped in religious practices and ideas and language, but I haven't found an institutional home, nor am I looking for one, because frankly, I feel like I have covenanted relationships, which are very important to me, and I'm a spiritual director. But at this point, I think we're in such flux that to bind myself to an institution at this point would not be serving me or the work I'm trying to do. That was a very long answer, but I hope it helped.
It's good. It's helpful because it kind of situates you in the I'll call the millennial project of
Yes.
sense making.
Yes.
Absolutely. Because unlike myself, I'm a baby boomer.
Yeah.
So in my case, actually, it's a little bit more complicated than that. My parents were not traditionally religious. But anyway, among many of my contemporaries, they had that as a background.
Correct.
So it sounds like you and your generation, if you will, you have to figure it out for yourself.
That's right. That's right. And it's interesting to me. I mean, we're talking in very big generalizations here, but something that I've noticed, even if we go with that, is that often Gen Xers, which is the kind of generation between the two of us, were the ones who might have borne the brunt, and I guess boomers as well, but particularly when I think of women in religious institutions or LGBT people or people who were pushed to the margins who said, well, like, then I'm leaving, but often leaving with trauma. People like me, I didn't even grow up with it. Do you know what I mean? Like, I had that small interaction in my middle school and high school, but it wasn't baked into the foundation of my family life. So my gay identity was never mediated by religion, for example.
Right.
Which I think there is a difference there more and more, which is why I think millennials, when you introduce some elements of tradition to them, they're actually hungry for it because they're looking for something of depth and something with heritage that connects them through time. Because so much of what's offered to us in a kind of meaning-making, community-building way is very effervescent, or it's very, it's mediated by corporate brands. So like, how deep is that really? I just saw a latest ad campaign from Ray-Bans that says, I belong, something like, I belong to my tradition. And I was like, you're selling sunglasses with belonging and tradition. I mean, it's just remarkable how good these brands are at seeing the need, but often very poor at filling what's actually the desire underneath. So I think that's an interesting interplay at a generational level, that there isn't some of that religious trauma at play in the same way, at least not at such scale as I think we did see in the previous generations who really had to withstand the brunt of such institutional failure.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about millennial spirituality and maybe how it's different from previous generations. You studied this a lot, and please plug your report because I think everybody should read it. It's really great. How We Gather, I'm referencing.
Yeah, thank you so much. I am surprised that my career was built on a 20-page PDF document, but here we are. Myself and a dear friend and colleague, Angie Thurston, both of us came into the divinity school in the same year. And she'd come from a creative arts background, and I'd come from this activist background. But both of us were asking the question of where do people like us, who don't fit into a traditional religious box, go to find belonging? Where do we find community? And we just started asking people. So we asked friends and friends of friends and strangers and really just talked to people for a year and a half. And over again, they talked to us about communities like CrossFit or Soul Cycle or maker spaces or justice groups or anything from something like Group Muse, which brings kind of classical music together with people who have a living room in which people can play, or communities like Thread, which are based in Baltimore, kind of builds a sort of family around young people who are at the risk of dropping out of school, for example, where their strategy is love, to surround a young person with 8 people who are just going to show up every week. And these are all secular organizations, but what seemed to be happening within them to us looked very much religious in terms of even the language people use to describe it. So the number of people who said, "Oh, CrossFit is my church," or like,
really?
It's like,
wow.
"Oh yeah," or like, "It's like a cult, but I love it." Or I mean, even some of them, right? Soul Cycle. The word soul is in the brand name.
Right.
When we called them this was 2015 or 2014, and we spoke to a brand manager. We spoke to the kind of like head of PR or something. And we said, "Oh, hello, we're calling from Harvard Divinity School," which is helpful. People pick up the phone if you're from Harvard. And we milked that for all it was worth. And we asked, can you tell us, like, what does soul mean to you? And she was, first of all, very hesitant about being on the record, and then very concerned about talking to someone from a divinity school. And then she said, "Well, soul is really just a brand concept." But the irony is, since then we've gotten to know the founders of Soul Cycle very well, and actually for them it did have a spiritual mission at its heart. And so this is something that we've seen over and over again, is that these secular organizations or communities, the people who are running them actually often feel a calling to that kind of soulful leadership. They might never use that language, but when we kind of held up a mirror and said to these folks, because we started to gather these secular community leaders, the first one was in 2015, 50 of them in a room, and we gently introduced, in a language of our divinity school, the work you're doing, this leadership, this care of souls, is ministry. And we were expecting real pushback, especially folks who are secular can be very hesitant about religious language. the opposite happened. These leaders were thrilled that someone recognized that they were not just doing nonprofit management, right?
Wow.
That they were not just even building community, but they were helping people navigate the most beautiful and hard moments of their life, right? Someone who's a CrossFit trainer was getting text messages saying, should I divorce my husband?
Wow.
You know, they're hosting weddings. They are accompanying people through the, you know, through grief, through loss, through new jobs. At one CrossFit box that I joined here, it was fascinating to see. Not only did you have like new mothers groups and bring your kids to workout day, but they also had a sort of a talent night. And so people were picking up their cello to play for the first time in 20 years, or they were doing stand-up comedy, or, you know, it was a place in which people could become more of who they were. Like this was a place that invited people's gifts. And so what we ended up seeing was this whole landscape of secular organizations that were doing religious things, but with none of the community around and support around their leaders, and also none of the accountability, frankly, around leadership. So all the classic things that go wrong in congregations, turns out they go wrong in these communities as well, but there's no oversight or support that you might find in a denominational context. So more and more we started to see ourselves as kind of a connective tissue, revealing something that just hadn't been seen yet. And I think in this report you mentioned how we gather, we look at what, you know, we look at 10 organizations and try to tell some stories. And over again, we saw 6 themes that showed up. The first one, of course, was community, right? The number one thing these people felt like they were building was community. But often they were talking about personal transformation, whether that was physical, whether it was more about people's intellectual growth, people's ethical growth. You know, there's one of those phrases in the CrossFit community, the way you show up in the gym is the way you show up in life. So if you're late and you're kind of self-oriented in the gym, versus if you're someone who shows up early to help set up, who's there to cheer on other people, who's there to like finish off someone else's reps if they weren't able to do it, like that's how you're going to show up in life. So there's this sense of ethical formation. There's also social transformation. So this was often around questions of equity and justice, or around beauty. How do we make the world more beautiful? Creativity, which was a lot about inhabiting play and being in work where people didn't feel like they could exercise their creative spirit, that this was a place they could make things. Accountability, which is my very favorite one, because in religious communities, there's often such anxiety about holding people accountable for good reason, because there's such a painful history of exclusion. But at the same time, and the fitness communities, again, are the strongest at holding people accountable, because really it's a sign that I believe that you're capable of achieving the goals you set for yourself. So it's this beautiful, when it's done right, it's this beautiful moment of belief, of showing up for one another. And then the final one was purpose finding. So within these 6 themes, we just started to see more and more communities show up. And the needs that those leaders had were very consistent. They felt lonely. They felt like they weren't resourced to do the work that suddenly they found themselves in. And nearly always they had created a community that met their own needs at first. But then as they'd done it for 5 years, their own needs had changed and they wanted to go deeper. But they were still serving a community that was, you know, where those people's needs were being met. So more and more we started to write about this field and to convene groups of people who were interested in learning more about it. So I think what was interesting, and the final thing I'll say just on how that applies to millennial spirituality, is that the language that we've traditionally used to describe people's religious identities or spiritual life, it just didn't fit with the reality of these people's experience. So it wasn't that all of them were non-religious. That became very clear. Because some of them would still go home for Christmas, or their husband was Jewish, or, you know, they kept some of their Hindu traditions alive, but they mixed it with, you know, insight meditation timer and going to their running group, or they were kind of piecing together their lives in a way that was very familiar, because that's what I've been doing. So we started to see the kind of ways in which the language and the identities that you would see on the Pew Forum questionnaire, for example, fell short of these people's lived experience. And without a language to describe it, they actually ended up devaluing their own spirituality.
Mm-hmm.
And because they, you know, if you don't have a community to share it with and you don't have language to describe it, Nancy Ammerman's research at Boston University is so great at proving this, then the only way you can handle it is by kind of making it less important in your life.
Wow. There's a lot of places to go here, but there's two I particularly want to go to. One of the artful things that you did in the report, I thought, was that you talked about sort of antecedent organizations.
Yes. Yes.
And that kind of leads me to the question as to if we're talking about millennial spirituality, what about the predecessor groups? What's different between the millennials and these predecessor groups?
Well, that's a beautiful question. Yeah, we talked about, for each case study that we did, we talked about their ancestors. So for example, for the dinner party, which is a millennial focused group for people who are living life after loss, we saw very closely how this was connected to something like Alcoholics Anonymous, for example, a group gathered together to have an intimate conversation that's very countercultural, in which they share things that's hard. And so in some ways, the more I've done this work, the more I've realized nothing is new, because I mean, we've one of the most fulfilling conversation partners we've had over the last 2 years is a group of Catholic nuns, of sisters, women religious. And we hosted with some wonderful partners, we co-hosted an event that we called Nuns and Nuns. So Catholic nuns, but also NONES, right? The unaffiliated.
Right.
So we had these women in their 60s and 70s who'd taken vows, you know, decades ago, and these kind of young millennials who were exploring their spiritual life. And one of the millennials said, "All I want is to transform myself in the context of community to serve the world." And Sister Mary at the back of the room said, "That's religious life." And so, you know, it really was this recognition of, gosh, these are just human longings, you know. And so our assumption at this point is that nothing has changed in terms of what we're looking for. We all want to belong. We all want to become. But the ways in which it's being expressed, or the institutional context, or the cultural landscape in which it's happening, that is changing. So, for example, an obvious one is the role of technology. More and more we saw how, for example, Buddhist geeks, which kind of brings together geek nerd culture and Buddhist wisdom and practice, they would host meditations online. So you could just join, as we are now, in a virtual Zoom room or a Google Hangout. And that would be a way for you to feel like you weren't doing it on your own, to have some accountability, that you would show up, etc. But also a chance to feel part of a bigger community. Or you had something like Tea with Strangers, which is an app that essentially acts like a dating service. But if you've moved to a new city, it's a great way to make new friends. So you get matched with people who might like to have tea with you. So some of the connections were being mediated through technology. I think one of the big shifts is the way in which people engage hierarchy. There's deep suspicion of centralized leadership and authority that is not relational. There is a real resistance to anything that is just consumed. So the idea of going to a church or a synagogue and just sitting there and something happening, and then you leave again and you give them some money, was unsatisfying. People wanted to be co-creating. So you see this rise in dinner churches, for example, or Shabbat dinners as a real huge growth area within the Jewish world, because people want to be part of making the food and washing up the food, the sense of you're co-creating the experience. So all of those seem to be kind of just markers. Now, a mistake that some people make is to say, oh, well, if they're millennials, you know, everything has to be new or everything has to be watered down. My experience is very different. You mentioned a podcast that I host called Harry Potter and the Sacred Text, where we use ancient reading practices from the Christian and the Jewish tradition, but instead of with Talmud or the Bible, we do it with Harry Potter. So every week we read a chapter and we do Lectio Divina, we do Chavruta, we do I was in the studio yesterday. We were doing Ignatian kind of imagination, right? Where for St. Ignatius, he would teach people to imagine themselves into a gospel scene, while we invite you to be Hermione or Harry or Ron, and to use that as a moment to, what do we learn more about the characters in this scene, right? If we're noticing what we smell or what we touch or what we hear, but then what does that teach us about what it is to be human, right? What our own experience is also. And so my joy has been that if you bring the depth of tradition in a way that it meets someone's contextual understanding, right? People already love Harry Potter. I don't need to convince you about the text, but I can help you get more out of life by giving you this ancient spiritual technology, right? And so I think what's interesting to me is that some of the most effective millennial spiritual communities actually draw deepest on tradition, but they come at it from a slightly different angle, or there's a different set of assumptions. There's no, boundary of belief, for example. A lot of these communities were bound by orthopraxy rather than orthodoxy. So no assumed shared belief, but there was a commitment to shared practice.
Mm. So that leads me to something else. So you mentioned this collaboration or collaborative event between the nuns and the nuns.
Yes.
As you know, it seems like, at least in the Western world, traditional religion is in a process of slow decline.
Yeah.
These institutions that are churches, less and less people are going to them. I don't know very many people that go to church, other than maybe people that go to something like a Universalist Unitarian church,
right,
which arguably is not a traditional church in any sense of the word. So
be careful. UUs will come to hound you.
I go to one, so I'm okay, right?
Okay.
But the conversation, if you go to like a traditional religious institution of any sense, how can we get people in? They don't want to come.
Yeah.
And your work seems to indicate that there's something that's useful about these institutions. What do you tell people that maybe ask you that question? How can we be more relevant as a traditional whatever?
Yeah. Well, this is I never expected to be talking with Methodist bishops and Jewish foundations. I mean, really, I couldn't have told you the difference between a Presbyterian and a Methodist until a few years ago. But the reason why we have engaged with religious institutions is not because of some innate desire to help them. It's really the fact that these new communities struggle with problems that these institutions could help with. So, as I said before, all of these new communities, right? If you started with one and suddenly it grew, and now you have 400 local groups all over the country, well, turns out you've basically got a conversation about polity, right? Like, how do we make decisions together?
Right.
And these institutions know how to do that, or at least they have some lessons that they've learned. And so we found ourselves again and again discovering wisdom in these traditions that would be so helpful for this emerging landscape. And so one of the biggest things that we've done is to try and reorient people who are inside congregations or institutions away from the question which you helpfully asked, which is, how do we get people in? Because that's not going to happen. The culture at this point is so widely different between these two groups that you're really dealing with two very, very different ways of engaging spirituality, and to cross that bridge at this point, I feel is not going to happen. Gil Rendell, a wonderful Methodist kind of congregational strategist, has written beautifully about this. Just essentially two different paradigms. But what institutions and congregations can do is to go out into the world and say, how can I come alongside what I see is happening? So some of the beautiful stories that we've encountered, and we helped to facilitate an elder matchmaking kind of process where 40 of these new community leaders were matched with 40 often ordained elders from Christian, Buddhist, Muslim, Jewish, and secular contexts, but most of them were ordained. And so the point was not that they had to learn something, about a strategy from the elder. The elder was really there in service of the millennial leaders flourishing as a community leader. And some of the advice ended up being logistical, right? Like, I have this relational challenge with my co-founder, or how do I navigate this law, right? Or I feel like I'm not worthy of this community and I'm being projected on in 100 different ways. Or how do I do a ritual moment for someone who's just had a baby, right? Like, questions ranged from all across that spectrum. And what happened was so joyful, because not only did it serve the younger leaders in very practical ways, but the older people were like, oh my goodness, I found a place where the wisdom that I have accrued can live anew. And this is what's so powerful about the nuns, because as women in the Catholic Church, they've never had power. And so unlike congregational presidents or ordained leaders, and certainly denominational executives who feel like their mandate is institutional maintenance, right? Like, I don't want to be the one on whose watch the whole thing collapsed, so I'm going to fight tooth and nail to hold it together. these women in their 60s and 70s and 80s say they have the faithfulness, I would say, to say, I trust in God's creative, call. And the call I felt at 19 or 21, right, when I went into the convent, I believe that's out there just as much as it was when I was at that age. I just know that it's going to look different from my experience. Carol Zinn, who's now the executive director of the kind of umbrella group for nuns in America, the LCWR, she says that any religious community is in her language, a radical response to the gospel in a specific historical and cultural context. And so these nuns are they're spiritually mature enough, frankly, to be okay with the fact that their expression is dying. Not that it was wrong or that it was bad. It was just specific to a particular cultural context. And so they now look into the world saying, how can I come alongside things that are emerging? How can I be a friend to someone who's just starting out? How can I, maybe find, it can be very simple. How can I find a space in which people can meet? How can I, all of the very practical and spiritual ways of spiritual accompaniment that how can I come alongside a new leader, and that has just been amazing to find the religious leaders who are willing to be that kind of humble, both in the sense that they're willing to be of service and place someone else's interest before their own, but then also to still know that they have something to give, because the other way that people can go is either maintenance or shame, and it just feels like I have nothing to give, right? We don't know anything, and that's ultimately not a productive stand either. So that's some of the ways in which we've seen that kind of cross-generational accompaniment happen in beautiful ways.
Let me ask you a provocative question, Casper.
Sure.
And I don't expect you to have an answer, but maybe you have some thoughts about it. When I look at a lot of these organizations, a lot of the organizations in your reports, and a lot of these, I'll call them spiritual organizations, these are almost all white organizations.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And I mean, what are your thoughts about that? I mean, what are the causes and what's to be done about it, if anything?
Oh, you're 100% right. And you'll read How We Gather, especially, is massively white. When we wrote How We Gather, we were two students talking to friends and friends of friends. And as two white kind of like upper middle class people at Harvard, you bet that our area of friends was not representative of the country. And so that's 100% correct. Now, there are some statistical pieces of people who are non-religious are more likely to be white, right? There are some trends within the data, but that is in no way descriptive of the bigger picture of this moment in our country. And frankly, we as a team have been on a huge journey to learn to recognize how these themes are showing up in communities that look and talk differently to how we do. So we've been, over the last year, really 2 years, we've been looking especially at how are people finding communities of becoming. So if How We Gather really looked at that belonging question, community, we're now really interested in this question of formation. Where do people go to become the kind of person they want to be? Now, I could tell you about yoga teacher trainings, and I could tell you about, things like Landmark or the Hoffman process or retreats, or there's all sorts of things that I know in my context. But we worked with an amazing friend and researcher, Daryl Jones, who basically we asked, look, can you help us see where are formation projects happening, especially in communities of color, or as he's introduced me to say, prophetic communities. So it's not about being marginalized. It's actually that people at the margins have prophetic wisdom because they see things with more insight. Frankly, they see the truth, and so the kind of communities we have learned about have just blown my mind. For example, a kind of network of young people. This started on the basketball courts. The jellyfish, no, was it Jellyfam? Oh my God, I love Jellyfam. So this was basically a group of kids who created an ethical code of conduct on the basketball court, which then started to transcend the court and started to spread amongst young people on the East Coast. And it really became like a school with its a way of being with its own interaction rituals and handshakes and all sorts of things. And so a big lesson for us has been like, the reason why white communities are really visible is because they're desperately wanting to be visible. So all of the communities and how we gather literally had similar logos, right? They all had Squarespace websites. Like there was an aesthetic that you could recognize. All their logos were nearly always circles. There was just, everything looked like it was on Pinterest or on an Airbnb, advertisement. And so we've had a real fantastic experience of widening our lens to understand, like, yes, I think these contextual pieces of decline in religious identity, change in how people engage spiritual life is true. But it does look very different. So another example is to think about the focus at the moment, especially you saw this around the movement for Black Lives, was engaging kind of ancestral healing journeys. So whether it was bringing in folk traditions, right, pre-Christian African indigenous traditions, or burning sage at protests, or kind of using one of our favorite case studies was Afro Flow Yoga, led by a couple here in Cambridge, where they lead a group kind of through a reenactment of the journey of the Middle Passage through dance. And it's this incredible 2-hour kind of full-bodied session with music and movement, in which you really take that journey through slavery into freedom. Mm-hmm. And they don't necessarily say that, but when you hear them talk about it, and you understand how their own journeys to Ghana informed this practice, you start to see how that lives in the community and lives in the practice, and the way they teach other teachers now. So it's a really important question, and it's one that has it's been a journey for us, I can tell you.
Casper, I could talk to you for hours, but
let's do it.
I want to ask you a personal question. I kind of wrote this down because I forget how to really do it. So I'll just read it.
You bet.
So you have this report, Care of Souls, and you write American needs to care for its soul. Very provocative statement. And I'll quote, it says, as more of us step away from religious identity, we don't even have common language to talk.
Right.
So, Casper to Kuile, how do you go about taking care of your soul on a daily basis? What do you do to rejuvenate yourself? It's a tremendously confusing time that we share.
Oh boy, yes. Oh, that's a great question. And I really want to, I want to stress that report was written with my colleagues Sue Phillips and Angie Thurston, and really all of this work comes out of a collaboration. So I am only one face of the team, but I mean, it's an ongoing practice. Like I'm really trying to play with creating my own rule of life at the moment, taking that monastic tradition and finding hopefully a new way in. And there's a few practices, the most important of which is my Sabbath practice. So on Friday night, I turn off my phone and I turn off my laptop and I light a little candle and I hold it and I sing a little song. And for 24 hours, I really try and this came out of reading Abraham Joshua Heschel's the wonderful track, The Sabbath, about 5 years ago. I try to see it not as like rest to get back to the work, but I try really to see it as the high point of the week, right? That the work week leads you to this moment of a taste of heaven, as the Jewish literature would tell us. So that I find extremely restorative and creative. It's when most of my best ideas, it's not that they don't happen throughout the rest of the week, but during that time they have a place to land. Like I'm not running from one thing to another. So that's a very, very important practice for me. I mean, I spend some time on my meditation cushion in the mornings, but I try to sing once in a while with others. That for me is the moment when I feel part of something bigger, when my voice is mingled through others. But and I'm in a beautiful covenant relationship with my colleagues. Like we really practice that kind of actually Unitarian Universalist model of covenant where we've made certain agreements of how we want to be together, and we pay real attention to that. We tend to it. I will say that between that and my marriage, all my ugly stuff shows up and I can't escape it. So let me put it this way, there's plenty of work on the workbench for me. But I really do see, the relationship between the inner and the outer, like, because frankly, I'm told that by the nuns, who at this point, I believe anything they tell me because they're just so wise and generous. But the people I react to in a way where I'm like, gosh, I want to be like them one day. You know, when people have just exude that spiritual maturity, that groundedness, that endless compassion, they are the work is just another expression of who they are in the world. And I hope to be like them one day.
Well, that's wonderful. So if people want to know more about what you're doing, what's the best way to go about it?
Absolutely. Well, if you want to read the reports, which is where I'd suggest you start, go to howwegather.org, and you'll see a little link there to various reports. I also write a weekly reflection. So if you're interested in hearing more about kind of the intersection between community and spirituality and culture change, you can go to my website, which is Casper, CASPERTK.com. And just click at the bottom of the page where there's a little button to sign up for a newsletter. And I hope people enjoy it. And I'm always eager to hear what people are reading or thinking, and new ideas travel virally. So it's very much a two-way engagement.
Well, let me just say a little bit about the Diversity and Spirituality Network,
Please.
and then I'll formally say goodbye and thank you. If you want to know more about the network, the simplest way is to join our Facebook group. We have a private Facebook group that you can belong to just by searching for Diversity and Spirituality Network on Facebook. And also on the third Saturday of every month, we have an online community gathering, which you can also find out about that. Actually, in the fullness of time, I might ask Casper to facilitate one for us. And he's nodding our head, and I'm delighted. And if you really want to support us, you love the podcast, please support us on Patreon by going to diversityandspirituality.com. No, excuse me, Patreon, looking for diversityandspirituality.com. Casper de Kuile, it is an enormous pleasure to meet you. I'm so inspired by your work, and I hope to learn more about it. And I'm following you. I get your newsletter and everything. And it's just been a privilege to talk to you.
Well, likewise. I hope one day I get to ask all the questions and we'll get to continue the conversation. But thanks so much for all you do. And I'm so grateful, as I know so many people who listen to the podcast are. So thank you.
Wonderful, Casper. Let me close this thing out here somehow. I always can remember to do so, but exit full screen. Thanks a lot, man. Great. I'll be in touch.
Thank you.
All right.
Angela, can I teach you the Zoom high five? Just like that.
Great.
All right. Hey, thank you so much. I really appreciate everything you're doing and your generosity of this invitation. Thank you.
Okay. We'll be in touch. Thanks a lot, brother. Bye-bye.